Hi, this is Richard Claus again, Student Engagement Staff at Glendale Community College for our Philosophy 101 class, working through our second video on virtue ethics. I just got done doing the first video, and for those of you that watched that, you obviously have to hear me, but also hear my neighbors, the children next door, playing rather loudly, so hopefully that wasn't too distracting, but they're home from school, obviously, and they're enjoying life. This video, I wanted to do a little follow up on a few things with virtue ethics. We actually looked at our reading last time, talked about Aristotle, and the actual reading itself. I want to follow up with a few issues in terms of some of the positive aspects of virtue ethics that philosophers recognize, perhaps you've seen, and then also maybe some of the problematic areas, or where are some of the weak spots that philosophers have pointed to and say, hey, there's an issue here we need to look at. So that's what I want to do in this video, sort of round out the entire discussion, because virtue ethics is, when we looked at Aristotle, he's obviously an ancient philosopher, and yet virtue ethics is very much alive today. Philosophers pursue virtue ethics. Many philosophers think that an ethical theory might have to have virtue ethics as a part of their ethical theory and at some level. So again, every one of these ethical theories has modern proponents of them, whether it's utilitarianism, act or rule, whether it's Kantian deontological ethics, and same with virtue ethics, and these things come up. They come up in specialized fields, sort of the subfields of also like bioethics in the medical community, and virtue ethics comes up in terms of how we care for patients and what kind of person we're going to be as a doctor or a nurse. And so again, contemporary, real issues, real philosophical issues, so to be aware of them just makes you that much better as a thinker and hopefully as a person. Virtue ethics focused on the agent of the action, their character, and the focus is not on the action itself. We talked about that last time. We talked about action-based ethics like utilitarianism or Kant's deontological ethics. They focus on the right thing to do. Virtue says, what about, are you the right kind of person? What is it to be the good person rather than to do the right action? If you are the right kind of person, then you will naturally do the right kind of action. So in favor of virtue ethics, what are some positive elements? Here's a few. Number one, we often judge, morally we judge people's motivations and character, not just their action. Think about that. We often morally judge people's character and their motivations and not simply their action. Did you obey the maxim or the rule? For example, we think about somebody, let's say we find out about somebody giving money to charity, and we begin to realize the only time they ever do that is if they're a politician and they're seeking office. So every 4 years or every 2 years, whatever they have to rerun for office, that's when they get really excited to give, and they make sure there's always a camera in front of them showing them exactly giving a certain amount of money to charity. We're like, you know, you're doing the right thing, giving to charity, but I question your motives. It always seems to be when the camera's on and only then. And so something about your character is at play there. Think about on the other side of things. Let's say you have an action you think is wrong, but we may temper our blame of somebody if they do something wrong, given their situation. For example, take this example. If an action is done from an admirable motive, let's say you have an employee and they're lying to cover up a fellow employee's theft. We say, well, that's wrong. You shouldn't lie. You shouldn't lie to your employer about a fellow employee who was stealing from the company. Hey, did Jim or Susie steal from the company? And you say, no, he or she didn't, when they actually did. You're lying to your employer. But we might recognize if the person did that from motive that says, I'm trying to protect their job because I know that they can't live without their paycheck, and they've got kids to feed. So the motive is somehow different. Versus a second motive that you might have would be like, well, I'm lying because later on I can blackmail them for money, right? We would recognize, now we might say, hey, in both cases lying is wrong. But we might recognize in the one case this motive that says I'm trying to protect a person's job, and we might say that's not the best way to do that. We might say there's other ways to do it. But still we recognize something about their characters coming through. And so we recognize that we do take motives into account, not just did you or did you not obey this or that rule. Number two, sometimes the manner of acting itself is part of what we do. Basically, how we do what we do may be just as important, or may be actually part of the action itself, the very fact of how we do it. For example, here's an example some authors gave. They said Earl borrows some money from his brother Jake. And Earl says, hey Jake, I'm going to pay you back in 30 days. And so it's during week 4, Jake gently reminds his brother, hey Earl, remember you said you'd pay me back in 30 days. Well, Earl then comes back into Jake's house, comes storming in, slams down the money, and huffs away in this action that says, there. We'd say, yeah, you kept your promise, so you obeyed the rule. We should keep promises we make, right? Kant would be satisfied. You kept your promise. But something about the way in which you did it, the manner of acting was wrong. It manifested a character. It manifested a lack of virtue in terms of, and you hurt relationship. This is an interesting point too. Many times virtue ethics has a greater stress upon the moral community of which you're part of. It's not simply what am I doing as an autonomous individual, but I find myself situated in a moral community. That could be a family, that could be a neighborhood, that could be a classroom, that could be a work environment that you work with. And so I have obligations to others, not only to follow the rules, but to manifest certain virtues toward them. And so oftentimes virtue ethics takes into account, in many ways, in a stronger way than other ethical theories do, this larger moral community. What are my responsibilities to the other? So that's two reasons. Number three, authors J.P. Moreland and William Craig mentioned this, their sentence, its core notions, the core notions of virtue ethics, of the purpose of life, the good person, character, and virtue, all these things, capture much of what is central to the moral life. And so they recognize, even if you don't think this is a complete theory, this does capture many intuitions, like these are important things for the moral life, purpose of life. You know, what's your end, or your telos, that teleological element? Or what does it mean to be a good person? Not just did you obey a certain action. Number four, it allows us to recognize degrees of goodness and badness. One author raised this, they used this example. Let's say a person or a set of people think that abortion is wrong. There are those that think that. We can evaluate two scenarios differently. You've got a 14-year-old that commits abortion after being raped by her uncle. The person may still say that abortion was still wrong, but I recognize that's a different kind of badness than perhaps the 31-year-old who has an abortion for the 5th time and simply uses it as a form of birth control. So if a person who is on the side that says all abortion is wrong, they would recognize both of these as being wrong because it violates the principle that they're holding to, that they would see as a moral maxim. But you can begin to recognize with virtue ethics, I can at least recognize there's degrees of badness that attach to it. One may be less bad or one may be worse because of the character and the motivations involved in it. And so that's just maybe an element of a positive for virtue ethics. Number five, another positive of virtue ethics, it recognizes that a good act is not necessarily the same thing as a good person. We intuitively recognize this, right? We can probably say that Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany probably did a few good things. Let's say if he took care of a cat or a dog, right? Whatever he did. But he was obviously a bad person. On the other side too, a good person, let's say think of Mr. Rogers. Recently watched the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, or about Mr. Rogers. Let's say a good person that we recognize universally as Mr. Rogers. Let's say he loses his temper once. Does he now, that was a bad action. Does he a bad person? We say, well, matter of fact, we have language for this. We say, well, that was really out of character for him, right? Because his character is known to be something as goodness. In that one instance, he blew up or got angry. That was out of character. But we recognize the goodness of his character over the long run. Doesn't make that instance right. Doesn't maybe not excuse it, but it does allow us to evaluate something deeper in the person themselves, so that the person is something we evaluate as well, not just the individual actions. Okay, what are some potential problems for virtue ethics? Number one, here's one. Does virtue ethics help us know what to do in specific situations? That's a classic problem or classic point of attention that philosophers have pressed upon virtue ethicists. Does this really help you know what to do? It seems to give little, specific guidance in actual situations. For example, let's say you have the virtue of compassion. Almost on everybody's list there will be the virtue of compassion. And person A is manifesting compassion. They say we should increase money for those on welfare. This shows compassion. Person B is also full of compassion, says we need to actually cut some of the benefits because long-term welfare has adverse effects. So we've got, should we increase the benefits of welfare or should we actually cut them back? Person A says yes, person B says no, both motivated by compassion. Now I recognize in our debates today, and I'm not looking to necessarily get into this debate, many times we demonize the other side. We say that if you don't agree with me, if you don't agree with increasing benefits, therefore you must be bad or you lack compassion. Or the other person on side B may say, no, because you keep wanting to do this to people, give these benefits without any responsibility, this is actually going to hurt people, you lack compassion, right? We demonize the other side. But if we can recognize for a moment that both may be working from a place of compassion, we begin to realize compassion by itself is not enough to decide what to do. We might need to examine some ethical principles. We might need to actually go out and examine what are the consequences that flow from these actions, right? So now we've got some deontological considerations, maybe you've got some utilitarian considerations. And this also works the same for justice. If somebody says, well, it's just that so-and-so gets such amount of money, or it's just that they only get that money if they work for it. The debates are the same. The issue here is, though, does the virtue in and of itself dictate or help us to understand which policy to adopt? Does it give us specific guidance? And so that seems to be a problem. It also points up the fact we're going to see in all these that maybe virtue ethics doesn't seem to stand alone. It doesn't have the resources to stand on its own 2 feet. It may need other things involved. Number 2, another problem issue, potential problem issue or tension. Can virtues be used badly? Think about this. One author raised the example of a white supremacist group that manifests the virtue of courage in planting a bomb in a Jewish synagogue. That's the philosophical example he raises, creates this imaginary example. We'd recognize, well, no, these are not good people. Although it may have taken this virtue of courage to do this. It may have even taken some intellectual virtues of wisdom and intelligence. We still recognize, wait a second, manifesting those virtues isn't enough. Even the moral virtue of courage, something about them is wrong. And so, as one author says, this seems to point beyond the virtues to something additional, some additional standard of evaluating the ethical significance of particular acts. So again, courage is an important moral virtue, but we need more, otherwise we might have virtues used badly. Number 3, how do we handle conflicting virtues? Take the virtues of honesty and loyalty. Most lists will have that. Let's say you have a person who works for their uncle's company. They love their uncle, and the uncle then comes to them and asks them to fudge the numbers for tax purposes. I want you to basically lie about our numbers. Say we've got this number when we actually don't. And the person knows that. You've got two virtues now. Loyalty is a virtue to my uncle, whom I love, and is a family member. Larger term issues that maybe are out, how that might make Christmas dinner feel if you have to, go rat out your uncle, and plus you love him. But the issue of honesty, well, if I'm going to lie now to the government, and so 2 conflicting virtues. So how does that help me in that situation? Number 4, which virtues are virtuous? Which virtues should make the list? Here's Plato's list: temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice. And we saw some of Aristotle's list last time, a little longer list. Augustine, a 4th century Christian philosopher, he added faith, hope, and love. Benjamin Franklin has frugality, being frugal, and avoiding, quote, trifling conversations, unquote. So you shouldn't be one who would try to avoid trifling conversations. That's on his list of virtues. And so sometimes the same virtue, even if they're on a different list, may have differing definitions. And this isn't a minor issue. So, well, that's just some little nitpicky. Stephen Wilkins, in his book on ethics, notes that love, for example, appears on none of the Greek lists as a virtue. And yet within the Christian ethical tradition, for example, love is the ultimate virtue. And so which virtue should be on the list? And again, Wilkins says, virtue ethics seems to be incomplete in itself. It constantly looks beyond itself to fill in the gaps. Okay, so if it needs something else beyond itself, those are some of the problem areas. Well, how might we relate principles, whether those are deontological or utilitarian principles, how might we relate those principles to the virtues? And there's a debate on this. Of course, there's a philosophical debate about everything, right? There's 2 different views, and I'll just mention them very quickly. The correspondence view says this, that virtues are derived, or they flow from, moral principles. So basically think about what comes first. We ask the question, what's the chicken or the egg? What came first? Well, here, what came first, virtues or principles? They would answer principles. Ethical principles come first, and then from them are derived these virtues. For example, their principle. You ought to tell the truth. And so you ought to have then a corresponding virtue for that, namely, develop a propensity to tell the truth. You should be becoming the kind of person who naturally wants to follow that principle. But the principle comes first. That's called the correspondence view, that basically the virtues correspond to some principle. Principle comes first, derived from it, then is the virtue. Of course, the other view is going to be a little differently than that. It's going to be what's called the complementarity view. The virtues, or at least some of the virtues, are not necessarily derived from principles. They stand in a more equal relation. One way to put this is that the virtues have an intrinsic value to themselves. See, in the other one, in the correspondence view, the virtue has what's called an instrumental value. It's simply a means to fulfill the principle. So the principle is absolute, and these virtues then help you fulfill the means. Within the complementarity view, you have sort of equal standing between the principle and the virtue itself. And some virtues, at least, if not all of them, but some of them have an equal standing, have some intrinsic value in themselves. Something like gratitude, some authors have pointed to. You can actually manifest gratitude or have gratitude as a virtue and not even express it in terms of any moral principle. And yet, so there we could still recognize the character of gratitude. And so those are some issues. So those are some of the issues that come up with virtue ethics. Again, live discussion still today amongst philosophers. Virtue ethics seems to have a lot of positives going for it. I think it has some significant issues, or at least some tension points with it, something to think about as you maybe think about what's your ethical theory. Because again, this is all, part of this is not just learning for a class or to answer questions on a quiz or a test, but what are the ethics you're going to live by? And so take those things that I think that are valuable in virtue ethics, so the fact that we have to train ourselves to become virtuous people. But I think, again, we have to look at these issues, like, for example, this philosopher Steve Wilkins points out, virtue ethics seems to point beyond itself to something else. It needs something else in the ethical theory in terms of at least some maybe standards or something like that, some principles. So that's it for today, so thanks a lot.